Today we're making a home office that folds out from the wall. It's a magnet.
The desk mounts on the wall and consists of two main parts, a steel frame with very simple plywood panels that are screwed inside of it. Let's start by making the steel frame. This is some old 1/8 inch thick, 8 inch wide steel flat bar that I had left over from the shipping container house build. It's been sitting outside for a couple years and is pretty rusty, so it's a good thing we're using Krylon Fusion All-In-One Spray paint, which is going to really save us a lot of time prepping all of this old rusty steel. After cutting the pieces to length with my angle grinder, I put on a flap disc and just removed the loose rust. Didn't spend a lot of time, I'm just trying to get the dirt and outer layer removed from the steel. 1/8 inch steel flat bar is pretty flexible, so I'm going to reinforce it with some 1.5 by 1.5 steel angles. Most of these cuts are just going to be straight perpendicular ones, but for the upper panel, I'm going to notch out some of the angle steel so that I can make an inner support bracket that reinforces the top flat bar. After notching out the pieces, I welded them together with my 4N welder and then cut them just about 3 inches wide. I now have a nice sturdy support that I can weld to the underside of the top piece of flat bar. Not only does this angle steel support keep the top flat bar from bending, it makes it much easier to weld these side panels on. It gives me a positive stop, and the top panel overhangs just a little bit past the width of the side panels. That makes it really easy to weld them together, and then later on I can grind everything down nice and flush. These right angle magnet clamps from MAGSWITCH make these types of metalworking projects really easy. Metalworking, you don't really need that many tools. I'm really just using an angle grinder and a welder, but these MAGSWITCH clamps help me make sure that my right angles, are exactly right angles. For the bottom panel, I'm just welding 2 pieces of angle steel together using some smaller pieces in between. Now I'm not welding a flat bar to this. I'm just using a scrap piece of flat bar as a width guide to make sure that this bottom structural panel made out of the angle steels is the same width as the top 1/8 inch thick flat bar panel. I clamped in this bottom frame and then just welded it to the side panels from the inside. I thought it'd be nice to have some shelves on the side, and I don't need the full width for the desk. So I just notched out another piece of the flat bar so that it would fit right around that angle steel upper support. Then I just welded it into the frame about 16 inches away from one of the sides. I ground the corners down nice and flush and rounded them over a little bit so nobody would get stabbed by them. I also added in another piece of angle steel just to stiffen up these side panels and to create a support for another shallower shelf on this little side compartment. Now to paint this steel, I'm using my favorite spray paint, Krylon Fusion All-In-One Spray Paint in flat white. I've just had such good results with this spray paint on all sorts of materials. I probably use it the most on metal, and it comes in really handy in these type of metal applications because you don't need a primer. You also don't need to do perfect prep work, which saves a bunch of time. You just have to get off the rough dirt and loose rust before hitting it all with a nice even coat. Even though this project looks a little more fancy than your typical DIY, I'm just using basic tools to cut all the wood pieces. Now, I am guiding them with my Kreg straight edge guide and portable CrossCut. These two measuring / guide type devices really give you a lot more value out of your basic power tools. And because this plywood is so strong, I don't need a lot of joinery. So the woodworking part is really just cutting out rectangles of different sizes. And that can be done really well with just the basics. The metal for this project was relatively inexpensive and was less than $100. For the wood components, I don't need a whole lot of plywood, but I am going to use a premium product. I'm using 3/4 inch thick walnut veneer Europly from Columbia Forest Products. This is about as nice as plywood gets. I sanded all the pieces to 220 grit and just gently rounded over the edges so nothing was too sharp. Initially I thought I would just embed a really strong magnet in the surface of the desk. So I made a quick router jig so that I could use my palm router to route out a recess. This was pretty easy to do, and I had no trouble epoxying a strong rare earth magnet into this cavity, but as you'll see later, I didn't quite route deep enough, and there was too much wood in between the magnet and the angle steel support on the upper side, and the latch really didn't stick. So you'll see how I solved that problem later. Now, to hide the routed out magnet, I glued on a strip of plywood that can be used as a handle to grab the desk/door to the cabinet. The desktop is going to be connected to a bottom shelf of the cabinet, and I just glued on a 3-inch wide strip. Remember, 3 inches is the same width as the upper support that I made out of angle steel, and this second 3-inch wide layer is going to give me the attachment point for these really nice small cheap brass hinges that I got from Home Depot. The 8-inch wide shelf underneath is going to serve as the positive stop that will hold the desk at a nice 90-degree angle. I placed some paint stirring sticks to space out the hinges, pre-drilled holes, and then drove in these nice little brass screws. Now you may have noticed that the walnut veneered plywood suddenly got a lot darker and shinier, and that's because I clear coated it with Minwax polyacrylic. Here I'm using the clear satin, and after removing all the dust with a clean microfiber rag, I brushed on a coat, let that coat dry, lightly sanded it with 300 to 400 grit sandpaper, wiped away the dust again, and then applied a second and final coat. This gives me a really durable, smooth, protective finish that looks great. Alright, the Krylon spray paint is all nice and cured, and I'm ready to assemble all the pieces. I drilled some small holes through the angle steel, and this is just going to allow me to use screws that go through the steel and into the plywood. The shelves were really easy, but I did need to use some heavy-duty clamps to lift the desk/door assembly up to the steel, hold it in place so that I could drive in the screws nice and tight. It was about at this point that I noticed that the magnet I embedded into the desk wasn't strong enough to hold onto that piece of angle steel on the top support. But no big deal. I just took a little block of 2 layers of the 3/4 inch plywood, drilled some shallow holes in it, screwed in some really strong rare earth magnets, rounded over the edges a little bit with my Orbital sander, and then epoxied on a layer of thin leather. This is just going to keep the magnets from scratching the metal, but the leather is thin enough that I'm still going to get a really strong connection. The entire cabinet weighs about 60 pounds, so not super heavy, but definitely not light. So I glued up a pair of 2x3s, painted them white, used a stud finder to locate studs, and then drove some nice 5-inch screws through this rail, through the drywall, and into the studs of the wall. I just used a level to make sure it was nice and straight, and now I can hang the whole assembly and drive a few screws through that angle steel on the underside of the top panel and into those nice double thick 2x3s. This project is a prototype for the shipping container hotel that I'm designing and building out here in Joshua Tree, California. Shipping containers aren't very wide, and so we wanted to have a place where people could send emails and do a little bit of work from a laptop, but not have a desk in there all the time that's eating up a lot of width in those narrow containers. Now, I don't think I'll be making 65 of these so that each room can have one made by me. I'm just thinking of this as a prototype, and after using it for about a month, I'll make some design changes and send drawings over to Semi-Exact so that they can turn this prototype into a product. So I'll be using this for about a month and really taking some notes on it to figure out what I want to change. Obviously, I'm going to have to figure out what sort of holes I want to drill through it to allow cord management, but I think we're off to a really good start.
So overall, I really like it. If I was to do it differently, I think I actually made the desk too long. It's about 25, 26 inches and probably only needs to be 18 to 20. I mean, there's a lot of depth here, and that would bring the overall height and weight down quite a bit. Now, one of the things it started as a mistake with the magnet not quite holding to the steel inside and having to do this extra magnet, but it also made me think that there's a lot of little magnetic devices that would allow you to hang things like, notes. You could basically, that really sticks on. There's little ones with like little clips, so you could do your own Post-its and little memory enabling devices and leave little notes and stuff for yourself, like almost like the refrigerator. The other thing that you could use for the magnets is to sort of like hang hooks that are on magnets like this, and then hang like your headphones and stuff like that inside past the door when it's closed or in the little side cabinet. So pretty good start, definitely some room for improvement. The other thing in using it for just a little bit is originally I didn't mind that the hinges were exposed. They're brass, they look quite nice. But if I made a rail that didn't go all the way back to the wall, but just covered just this hinge, then you could really put your work away. It would keep your laptop from sliding out and kind of hold it just a little strip of plywood, 3/4 of an inch. If you're more of a writer, you could put your books and notepads there. And that way, oh, gotta move these. God, those magnets really stick. You could really just, when you're done with work of the day, you could really just put it away. I also think you could keep extending modules on either side, maybe add a little bit more of a bar. And so if this is in your living room, it really transitions from working to leisure in one device. So let me know what you think in the comments below, and shout out to Krylon for sponsoring this video. Thanks. Bye.